Us. My name is Bonolo Makale, and I am the program manager of the. Okay. Good morning, everybody. A very good morning from a cold Pretoria. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Bonolo Makale, and I'm the program manager of the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit of the Center for Human Rights that is hosting this dialogue. We greatly appreciate you being here with us. Just before I hand over to my colleague Tariro, who will be moderating this session, I just want to say that today's conversation forms part of a series of dialogues with young South Africans as we prepare for the local government elections coming up in October. Essentially, the dialogues interrogate issues that affect youth participation in politics, youth voter apathy, and just how best this demographic can express themselves politically towards a meaningful engagement in civic space, but also just an overall contribution towards South Africa's democracy. For today's conversation in particular, we'll be looking at spatial justice, spatial injustice, and just focusing on the legacy of apartheid being continued. I'm hoping that we'll look at how the zoning laws of apartheid gave birth to the modern day organization of cities and post-apartheid South Africa. I think we can all agree that the one thing that the post-apartheid state did quite well was to develop a very good system that is self-replicating when it comes to spatial segregation and spatial justice issues. If you think about it in the Johannesburg context, for an example, you have Black people in Soweto, you've got mixed race people in El Dorado Park, you've got the Indian community in Lenasia, and then you've got a majority of white people in the north. And it's a system that was very well developed that we see even in the post-apartheid system, just perpetuating itself that way. And I'm also hoping that this conversation, we can collectively explore the effects of spatial injustice in South Africa, its linkages to apartheid, its linkages to race, class, and how it has perpetuated poverty and limited access delivery for some of the communities in South Africa. But as I mentioned earlier, that this is a conversation, a part of a series that we've been having with various young people. And I'm thinking that with reference to young people, I'm hoping that we can collectively explore the effects of spatial injustice on the South African youth and how it has affected their access to opportunities and broader socio-economic rights, and figure out if this challenge that we're having of voter apathy among young people, and I do need to say that while we accept that there's voter apathy among young people, it doesn't mean that young people are not participating politically. We have seen various social movements and political movements emerging that are led by young people. So I'm hoping that we can, while we interrogate this idea of spatial justice and spatial injustices, conversations around land reform, access to adequate housing, access to service delivery, and just broader access to socioeconomic rights. Does this have an impact in some way in how young people are engaging with the South African politics, but also just how young people are choosing not to go to the polls? And to do that, we've got exceptional experts that have graciously agreed to have this conversation with us. And I just want to say thank you to them. We've got Ms. Ntando Mlambo, who is a lecturer at the University of Free State at the Theology and Religion faculty there. And then we've got Mr. Boy from Difunokwas in Cape Town. He heads up the political organization and campaign of the organization. And then we've got Dr. De Villiers, who's also a senior lecturer at the University of the Free State, the law faculty there. And our very own Dr. Sanele Sibanda, who's a senior lecturer here at the University of Pretoria law faculty. And I'm hoping that, between the four of them and the audience here and everyone that is participating in this webinar, the idea is to have a conversation. So I'll encourage each and every one of you, if you have questions, if you have comments, put it in the questions and comments section. Let's engage. Because what we want to see out of this series of conversations is to develop some sort of a policy paper that captures key perspectives and ideas that have emerged out of these different conversations. As I mentioned, that this is all part of our work as we prepare for the local government elections. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm looking forward to this discussion and see where it lands us. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Tariro, who will be moderating this session. Thank you again.
Thank you, Bonolo, and good morning to those of us who are in the southern part of Africa, and good day to everyone else who's joining us from other parts of the continent and other parts of the world. As Bonolo said, today we are facilitating a discussion regarding spatial justice and spatial injustice in the post-apartheid state. And the impact that this has had. Now, before we get into the conversation and dialogue with our panelists, I'll make some brief reflections building on what Bonolo has said and just setting the context for today's conversation. As Bonolo says, the system of spatial injustice in South Africa was entrenched as a project of law during the colonial and apartheid era, and more fiercely so in the apartheid era, which gave birth to the zoning and the development of settlements based on racial segregation. What this meant in practicality for the post-apartheid state was that when apartheid was outlawed, this system perpetuated itself due to the fact that these settlements had already been developed and they had already been a project of law. Now, the land question and all of its facets, because of the effects of apartheid and racial segregation in South Africa, is a very topical issue, and one of the components of this is spatial justice, access to resources, access to adequate housing, access to dignity, and everything that encompasses the principle of spatial justice. As of 2018, statistics recorded that 13.6% of South Africans lived in informal dwellings. And this figure was set to increase because of rapid urbanization, the space and cost issues related to land development, which is ultimately the land question, or one of the components of the land question, as well as issues in the deficiencies of policy, resettlement, and housing policies within the nation. In 2019, it was reported that housing delivery had decreased in South Africa by 60%, and there was an estimated backlog of housing of 2 million houses nationwide, which translates roughly to about 12 million people in the country without access to adequate housing. Now, this has meant that a significant portion of the population is relegated to informal settlements. They're relegated to inadequate housing on the periphery of societies. And it has also led to a proliferation, of illegal occupation of settlements and people living in housing that is unserviced and on unserviced land, which does not have access to resources and access to the city, as it were. So 27 years on from apartheid, we're having this discussion. And unfortunately, despite the best efforts of the state, the population, and other actors, we still see the continued legacy of apartheid coming up in spatial injustice and its resultant effects. The distribution of space, the distribution of socially valued resources, and the access to these and the ease of access to this is an important component of spatial justice. And where people live, where the type of dwellings that they live in, and their ease of access to resources, their proximity to their workplaces, their schools, hospitals, and actually access to basic amenities is important in the perpetuation or alleviation of poverty for certain communities. So what has happened is that due to the perpetuation of the system, it has also perpetuated cycles of poverty, cycles of inequality. And we see this very strongly in South Africa, where this access to socially valued resources and their proximity and access to service delivery is still very unequal. And this is as a result of spatial injustice. And what we see is that race is one of the main dividing lines, as Bonolo mentioned in our opening remarks, but we also see class as a strong dividing line. And spatial injustice also has an effect on the participation of groups in politics, in economics, and indeed in everyday life of South Africans. So access to land and spatial justice are some of the main thematic issues that characterize the post-apartheid state, the political landscape, and indeed the socio-economic landscape, as I've mentioned, due to the access to resources or inaccess that comes as a result of spatial justice or spatial injustice. And these are highly polarizing issues which have varying degrees of perspectives in terms of how best we can tackle them. And that's one of the aims of this conversation, is that as we have a discussion with the experts and with the participants of the webinar, we aim to see different perspectives of how best we can tackle this ill, as well as the resultant effects. Among other issues, as Bonolo mentioned, such as disillusionment with formal processes, corruption, favoring of other methods of organization, this spatial injustice and the land question is a key issue that is deterring the youth from voting or taking part in political participation. It is also one of the key thematic issues which youth organize through other methods of organization, such as protest action, social movements, and others, to address this issue. So as we have our discussion this morning, I would just invite you to put your thoughts in the question and answer box, to engage with what the speakers have said. And as we collectively discuss this morning, hopefully what we do is see how social justice relates to access to opportunities and broader socio-economic rights, and interrogate questions around the effects of spatial justice, the entrenching of inequalities, and how we can resolve these issues, policy or otherwise. So without further ado, I will hand over to the panel this morning. We will just have the panel make brief reflections around this issue, and then we'll have a dialogue, question and answer session as we go on with the conversation. This webinar is being live streamed on YouTube and Facebook, and the session is also being recorded, and the recording will be available after the session. So as we begin our reflections, I'll just hand over to Ms. Ntando Mlambo as we start our discussion this morning. Thank you, Ntando.
Hi, everyone. Just to place myself before I give any thoughts, I am Ntando Nkosi Mlambo, and I am a theologian focused on church history at the University of the Free State. Now, my interests are church history within space, how churches in South Africa further spatial injustice or spatial justice, what has been done and what can be done with regards to church spaces for justice. So before we even think about spatial injustice and its how we mitigate it, I first like to look at what exactly is space. This term spatial justice and spatial injustice seems so abstract and ethereal. And a lot of geographers and academics who use geography as a point of reference say that space is boundless. It's this three-dimensional extent in which objects and events occur. It's a collection of spatial relations between objects and the world. Space is what results when we put a whole bunch of places together. According to David Harvey, space is a thing in itself. However, over the last couple of decades, we've seen this abstract thing in and of itself begin to move and to be seen as something that carries dynamics, power dynamics, social dynamics. And it is here we see what is called the spatial turn, where we see more than just the abstract and the things and places that we've put together, coming together to become space, but rather that we see how people control power and how people control social dynamics in and through space. So in South Africa, in general, the historical formation of space, and I will take it from the colonial era, is based on capital, colonial interests, and hierarchy. So the system of colonization and the overall thought patterns of coloniality, which are thought patterns founded on hierarchy, founded on what we see as towns, cities, rural, and urban, formed colonial South Africa and continues to plague post-apartheid South Africa. Now, in the study of spatial justice and spatial injustice, what I found is that we should look at both of these concepts together. So you are unable to accurately look at a way forward for spatial injustice without looking at spatial justice, and vice versa. So spatial injustice is an inequitable distribution of socially valued resources and opportunities, whereas spatial justice is the opposite of that. It is the fair and equitable distribution of socially valued resources and opportunities. South Africa has racially and class-based injustices which are placed within space, from internet access and how internet access is fiber-based within suburban areas and mobile-based within township areas. We have the differences in job availability based on where you live. There are the land ownership dynamics based on who you are. There is the area dynamics, so who lives where, and the history of the area being historically white, historically Black, is historically people of color. There's also distance from food, water, jobs, and what we call central business districts. So it's clear then that there are resources and opportunities set out for a particular set of people in South Africa. And COVID has made that abundantly clear to us with the need for aid during the hard lockdown, and also the recent unrest, making it clear with policed suburban areas during the unrest. I work with church history, so I like to mention the church quite a bit. In churches, you also see this power dynamic at hand. So you might have what we call the mainline churches, churches that have existed for a number of centuries, having more access to resources, having more housing for their clergy in good and well-located areas, versus churches who may be set in areas that do not have enough resources and cannot even exist and resist the spatial dynamic that they have. So those are the overall comments that I have so far, and I'm excited to see how we can discuss what youth can do to subvert spatial injustice to create this process of moving toward a future of spatial justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ntando, for that reflection and just putting the concept of spatial justice and spatial injustice into context. In your opinion, just briefly, before I move to the next speaker, who's Bushle Boy, would you say that spatial justice and spatial injustice within the South African context, would you say that we have examples of spatially just areas that we can sort of used towards gaining a more spatially just society? So you said that we cannot understand spatial injustice without completely understanding spatial justice. And would we have examples of that in the South African context, or is it more of a situation that we are looking outward towards gaining more perspective on issues such as this?
So I would say we have glimpses of what spatial justice might look like. And I think we will discuss this a little bit more later on. But let's say the concept that the African Center of Cities uses as central business districts versus integrated business districts. So they see central business districts as entrenching spatial injustice, because it creates this dynamic that the only way to have job availability is to live as close to the central business district as possible. And a glimpse of a possible journey toward equitable resources would be to have different integrated business districts. So having business districts within areas that are previously disadvantaged, and also providing jobs and infrastructure for those areas so that traveling for resource could be mitigated. So that's just one example of a glimpse of a possible spatial justice.
Thank you, Ntando. And I'll also open up that question generally to the rest of the panel and the attendees as we go throughout, to just think of if there are examples such as the one that you've mentioned within the South African context that can perhaps help us to move towards a spatially just, or a South African conception of spatial justice, because I mean, it's not a one size fits all. What might work in Peru will not work in South Africa. So it's something that needs to be contextualized. Thank you, Ntando. We'll move on to our next speaker, Mr. Butleboy, and just hear his initial reflections, and then we'll have a question and answer session.
Thank you so very much, Tariro. I must first and foremost maybe introduce myself. My name is Butleboy. I'm from the Funukwazi. I stay in Kayedicha, in one of the townships here in Cape Town. And I think a very important starting point in the discussion insofar as spatial injustice and its effect, particularly on young people and the youth. And I'll use this opportunity really to reflect on that concept as it relates to me as a young person and staying in Kayedicha in the peripheries, in the urban outer core, and what that means to me. And the reality, Tariro, is that spatial injustice in itself is a system or a concept that was engineered. It was engineered, deeply embedded in policies and laws. It was a legislated system that dates back to apartheid laws and policies, such as the Group Areas Act, and the Separate Amenities Act, and the Urban Areas Act, which were policies that were used to really segregate the people. These were segregationist laws that were aimed to ensure that whites and Black South Africans would not share common spaces or use the same facilities, as Ntando was saying here. And this continues to be the narrative of young Black or millions of Black workers and Black young people in South Africa today. Young, or rather Black people today continue to be pushed into the peripheries, continue to be pushed into the urban outer core where there's no social amenities. And this spells a trouble for our country. That 27 years into the so-called democratic dispensation, there's still no meaningful participation of Black people in the city center. There's still no affordable housing that Black people, or rather there's no spaces that Black people can claim to be their own in the cities. Still, Black people today are allowed to be in the city center from 9 to 5. After 5 o'clock, your ticket ends, you must go back to the peripheries. And this has caused somewhat of demobilization or hopelessness in young people today, because the majority of our people who are growing up in these times, their parents grew up in shacks in the townships, and this still continues to inform their own destiny, and this causes somewhat of really destitute and hopelessness amongst South African youth today, and just to briefly try to move from that point, is that part of the problems is that in South Africa today, there isn't necessarily a plan to mitigate against the legacy of apartheid. It's been 27 years since it formally ended, and we still have Black people being brought out of the inner city. We have cities being gentrified, and the prices of rentals in the city center being skyrocketed. And this is a form of exclusion and displacement of Black people from economic hubs of South Africa. So this speaks to this problem of the entrenchment of inequality in South Africa that continues to exist and continues to define the reality of the population and the majority of young people. And young people today continue to experience heightened vulnerability, particularly those that are living in the informal settlements in Khadija, where I'm from, because part of spatial injustice means that you are forgotten in the urban outer core, where there are no services, and people in the urban outer core have no communal basic services. People are living in occupied buildings. People are homeless, facing homelessness today as a result of spatial injustice, a system that was deliberately created to exclude people from socio-economic activities. And that is problematic, and part of the solution that we should be thinking around insofar as the inclusion and to deal with this question of the disenchantment of young people insofar as participating in the broader political activities of this country, particularly those are in the urban outer core. We need to start really looking at solutions in the global south insofar as where did we go wrong, what is it that we could do? And part of the solutions that we've been thinking around, particularly in the Funugas, is this concept of affordable housing. There is a shortage of affordable housing, and this is a result of apartheid era policies and influx control that is limiting African occupation of urban areas and access to these economic opportunities. And we were saying that there must be a housing, inclusionary housing policy that will regulate the developments, because the developments as they currently stand in Cape Town and across the country have catastrophic prices that are indicative of a market failure that is fueled by the rampant speculation. And there needs to be a regulation insofar as property development in South Africa, to say that every development that is being built, it must include a section of affordable housing, so that even the middle class, even the working class, can afford to stay in the city center. so that even those people that are living in shacks, there's land that is distributed and unlocked, prime land that is unlocked, so that the people can be included in the city center, closer to better schools, closer to better social amenities, so that we undo this legacy of apartheid. So that's just one of the ways to mitigate against the problems that come with spatial injustice. And the reality may be to give a narrative of what is happening currently in the political landscape of Cape Town and in Khayelitsha. And you see that young people are tired of the party politics as we know them, because people continue to live in squalor, people continue to live in informal settlements. And part of what we've seen in the past year is that we've seen land occupations in Khayelitsha, and people saying that we want to self-determine. We want spaces to live in. We want spaces to call our own. And this is a result of the failed system. Our people have fallen in the cracks of this system. So that's what you see as a result of that, and people really rejecting a party political system, saying that they're wanting housing. So that's the narrative, and that's the perspective of young people insofar as the outlook of politics today. And this speaks to this question of the land redistribution on equitable basis, and as something that must be fast-tracked in order to really mitigate against this challenge of spatial injustice that we're speaking about. Just in closing, it is very important. It is very important that we really speak of spatial injustice in real terms, insofar as who is affected by it, and the reality, the majority of people that are caught in the grip of poverty today is Black people in South Africa. And part of the solution is unlocking of prime land, not land, cheap land that is in the townships, land in the city centers, where the situation that land is being used for golf courses that pay under 1,000 rand per year for huge hectares of land, and people are expected to pay 4.5 per month in rentals, and that on its own speak to the disjuncture and the exclusionary nature of the market in South Africa, and that Black people are being continually excluded from participating in the socio-economic activities of this country. So spatial injustice really is embedded in the laws and the policies that are continuing, particularly that is evident in a city such as the city of Cape Town, that continues to be characterized by apartheid. We can see where and who lives where by just standing at the top of the lookout hill to see spatial injustice. And this already necessitates that we really look at the laws that continue to speak to the questions of space, the section 25 of our constitution, and to really speak to the heart of the issues of land redistribution, because that's a solution that will really mitigate against this question and the challenge of spatial injustice in South Africa.
Thank you, Buhle. You touched on some very important parts there regarding the role of the law, regarding the role of business, the role of economics, that it's a multifaceted problem with many layers and many solutions. As we go on to the next speaker, I would just like to also highlight something that you spoke about regarding the role of the law and the Constitution. And this might be something that the panelists and the attendees we might reflect on, how exactly we imagine the Constitution playing a role in this situation of redressing spatial injustice. And as we move on to the next speaker on the topic of constitutionalism, I'd like to call on Dr. Sibanda to make his initial comments.
Right. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I guess firstly is to say thank you to my colleagues at the Center for Human Rights for inviting me to participate on this panel, which is discussing what is really what's an important topic in the way that it brings together the subject of spatial injustice and the youth, because the future of this country, the future of our society, is reflected in how the youth see themselves and how the youth perceive of themselves having an opportunity or a stake or a part to play in our society. And the question of space is an important one, because if you can't find yourself having space in a physical sense to actually live, to grow, to learn, to thrive, and so forth, it is very difficult to imagine how one can see themselves having the intellectual or psychic space to self-actualize. So this is really an important topic, and I think quite a timeless topic. Now, having said that, I have just a few provocations or a few thoughts to throw into the conversation. They won't touch on the Constitution directly per se, but I think everything that's been said so far touches upon the important question of constituting, because I think in a lot of these conversations we tend to focus too much on the Constitution as a document that distributes power or sets out rights, and we don't think enough in terms of what role the Constitution should play in how we constitute as a society. What does it enable? Who does it empower? Who is included? Who is left out? What are the social, economic, and political relations that the Constitution establishes? So, having said that, as just a preliminary set of thoughts, I have about three or four provocations, which I'll try and keep relatively short, because a lot of the stuff that I have in my list of matters that I want to raise have already been raised very, very ably by my panelists, Ntando and Buhle, and dare I say that I think they've probably done more justice to them because of the detail and the careful ways in which at least Ntando takes us through what spatial justice is and what spatial injustice is, and then Buhle took us very, very ably and in a very visible way how spatial injustice continues to be a characteristic of our present lived experience. So, with kind of without much more, I guess the first provocation was one that came to me when I was reading the invitation to participate, and it relates to the centering of apartheid in conversations of injustice. And I think Ntando has already spoken to this, and Tariro herself in her introduction went a little bit of a way to destabilizing some of my concerns. But really the nature of my concerns are about this idea of centering apartheid Do we center apartheid as the source of the problem, as a convenience, or as a gesture of context? And the reason I raise this specifically as a problem is to ask, why is this the logical start point as opposed to actually going further back and also raising the question of coloniality, which Ntando has already raised. So it was really just to say that we must also be careful when we engage in conversations like this to not limit our interrogations to the apartheid period or apartheid zoning laws specifically, because in many ways, when apartheid comes into being as a consolidated project of the taking of governmental power, it doesn't come into being out of the blue. It is a continuation of a project of colonialism, of white supremacy and imperialism. So when we think about space, if we limit our thinking to start to focus on the apartheid period, I think we lose quite a lot of we lose quite a lot in terms of how we understand the origins of the problems of spatial organization in South Africa. And this leads me to my second point, which is really that it's to say that when we have these sorts of conversations, and then generally the conversations around constituting how we historicize questions of justice and injustice matters profoundly. There's a book that I have been I've been reading and working through on land justice in Kenya. It's entitled "The Struggle for Land and Justice in Kenya" by Professor Ambrina Manji, where Professor Manji makes the statement that really I have not managed to get out of my system because it just keeps resonating and making me think of other things. And she says, and I quote, "We must recognize that there is nothing past about historical land injustice." And I repeat that. She says, we must recognize that there is nothing past about historical land injustice. And this is really an important idea which Ntando and Butle have already also gestured towards. And it's really just to say that when we talk about spatial injustice in the current moment, we have to recognize the fact that there is an overlap between the situation that we face currently and the history of how these situations are formed. And what this speaks to is the importance of how we frame the problems, how we frame the problems that we are facing. And with respect to spatial injustice, how we frame the problem is important, because what are we really concerned with? Are we concerned with spatial injustice as a legal problem of zoning? Are we concerned with the space of spatial injustice as a problem of a lack of implementation of rights? And that's to say, are we, do we see it as a problem of law? Because if that is primarily and solely how we see it, then we're really missing a lot. And Butle's comments just in the direction that I want to head, and it's to say that it's important that we see spatial injustice as an issue of political economy, i.e., an issue that speaks to how our politics structures the economy, and how our politics is instrumental or important in determining who participates and how they participate. And equally the same can be said for rights. And how does all of this then connect with the question of political apathy with the youth? And the first point really is just to say that South Africa's spatial injustice is not just an issue of law or an issue of race. It's an issue of the economy, access to the economy, participation in the economy, the way that our cities are arranged were arranged so that the economic project of colonial apartheid, of expropriation, of exploitation, and basically having an economy that serves the whites in South Africa and the colonial metropoles could continue undisturbed, and to have that economy thrive and prosper, there was a need for labor, and who was going to labor at the lowest possible cost? It was Black people. So the organization of the spatial organization of South Africa broadly, be it rural and urban, has to do with the economy. And so how I connect this with political apathy is then to ask, if our primary concern with youth participation and youth apathy is around the question of politics, is politics really the most important question in the lives of our young people? And I would venture to say that I don't really think so. And I don't think so because if our focus on apathy and politics is around participation in elections, and that participation in elections does not connect to their economic existence and their economic empowerment, then who can really blame young people for not really being interested in politics as politics? I mean, one of the things that fascinates me about many of our young people is how they self-identify or self-characterize as a hustler generation. Now, if the hustle and economic empowerment is thought of or framed as a way to self-actualize for our young people, then our expectations of them to be interested in politics that doesn't connect with this, I think, is misplaced. And what I'm really saying then is that if we are to expect our young people to be interested in politics, then there has to be a way in which that politics is connected to how they self-actualize, how they make livelihoods, how they and how they improve themselves. So I think then in closing, it's really to say that the question of political apathy cannot be disconnected from economic disenfranchisement. And the economic disenfranchisement that we see is a product of colonial apartheid legacies that have not been addressed. And these legacies speak to redistribution, restitution, and various other facets of how wealth and income inequality in South Africa in this day continue to reflect the past patterns of wealth and income distribution that were put in place under colonial apartheid, under the colonial apartheid system. And I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Dr. Sibanda. I think those were very critical. It's tying up very nicely with what has been said by the other speakers and raising the most important question of how then are young people expected to take part in a politics that does not serve them, if you will. And I think that's another important discussion that we'll put out to the panel after we hear Dr. de Villiers' initial remarks. Dr. de Villiers, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tariro, and thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you so much for the other panelists who have already presented. And yes, what a great opportunity to speak on a very important and pressing matter. I'm going to start off with just raising a few ideas that came to mind when I looked at the invitation that I received from Tariro. And there are basically 4 things that I want to highlight. And I'll list them first and then expand a bit on them. Firstly, image and imaginings. Secondly, Edward Zoja. Thirdly, corruption and governance. Fourthly, apathy versus participation. So as the others have done, I am Isolde de Villiers and I am at the University of the Free State and I'm in the Department of Mercantile Law. So I am currently very much busy with my project, thinking about the relationship between space, law, and business. So let me then start with the first of these points I want to respond to from the invitation. Firstly, image and imaginings. The invitation starts with an image of Alex, the informal settlement of Alex portrayed in front of Sandton. So at the back, you see the high rises of Sandton, and in the forefront, you see the informal settlement of Alexandra. This image, another image that is quite popular, and I think you would know that image from the cover of Times magazine, is the aerial shot from above, where on the one side you see the affluent Sandton suburb, and on the other side of a line of the highway, you see Alex. And this image, this use of a different image, really sparked some ideas and some thoughts with me. And I think the main ideas here is that the important role of business and those high rises and how we see the city. So is the city these high rises, these business structures in the background, or is the city the informal settlement and the informal housing that we see in the foreground? Or is the city something else? Is it the people that live in the city, that move in the city, that use the city? And I think there I want to open up already the possibility of seeing the city, seeing space as relations. And that brings me to my second point, an engagement with Edward Zoja. The invitation refers to a quote from Edward Zoja. I think it is from his 2009 piece and not the 2020 piece. I was quite excited to see that Zoja published something so recently, but I think it is rather from his 2009 piece, which preceded his book that was entitled Seeking Spatial Justice. Now, Edward Zoja, of course, an important thinker in spatial justice theory. However, I want to look at Doreen Massey, a radical feminist geographer, and her critique of the work of Edward Zoja. And I'll tell you why now. I don't want to disregard the work of Edward Zoja completely. He definitely plays an important role. But let's pause just for a moment and consider the following critique from a feminist perspective by Doreen Massey. So she says that Zoja, like others, took up structuralism or said that structuralism had been one of the 20th century's most important avenues for the reassertion of space in critical social theory. But she says it seems to offer the opportunity to see everything all together, to understand the interconnections rather than the dynamics which push on the narrative flow. And she says it's perhaps the rather than which foreshadows the problems to come. And Massey sees space as the coming together of stories thus far. She insists on notions of coolness, of simultaneity, of relationality in her view of space. And that is her feminist intervention. I think this links very nicely with what Ntando has said about not seeing space in this bounded way. And I think it is in Tariro, in your introduction, you referred to this legacy of apartheid, and you say that we already sit with these settlements that have been created and that it has already been a project of law. But I want to say that what Massey adds to this idea and this understanding of spatial justice is the relationality, because what did law do? yes, it created these spaces, it regulated these spaces, but what did it actually do? It constructed certain social relationships, not only cushy, nice relationships, but relationships of power. And Boutle, that is something that you highlighted very importantly, and also Ntando, you pointed to these power dynamics. But I think to see law primarily as a system that structures these relations. So in producing the central argument of a radical geographer such as Doreen Massey is that space is produced by social relationships, unequal social relationships, and that in turn, these spaces then reproduce these social relationships. So perhaps then in response to your questions, Anele, whether this is a question of law, a question of space, or a question of politics, I think if one looks at it in terms of relationality, then it encompasses all of those facets and elements. She critiques, Massey critiques Zoja's work for being anti-feminist. Not because she says that women or gender should have featured more in his work necessarily, or mentioned more, but she does critique his work because he completely ignores feminism and the contribution of feminist geographers who have been raising the points that he makes and has been raising that for quite some time. She critiques it also because it lacks simultaneity. And this idea of simultaneity or equivalence really opens up for the possibility of a plurality of voices. And I think that's so vitally important when we work from the global south, is to have plurality, this equivalence, this idea that the world, that there is nothing like the developed world and the developing world. In other words, the developing world is not only behind in time and trying to catch up to the developed world. No, these are equivalent worlds. In other words, they absolutely coexist to open up this possibility for difference, for simultaneity and for relationality. And I think that's something that Edward Zoja does not offer in his work. Of course, Massey connects space really to time and says that it's time that opens space up to its radical potentiality, and it's space that opens law up to this uncertainty. And I think, Sanele, you've asked a question about history and time, and I think she introduces that possibility. I want to give an alternative idea of spatial justice, and I'm drawing here on Andreas Philippopoulos Michalopoulos, who works with the ideas of Doreen Massey, and he says specifically because, and Ntando, you've mentioned this, because there's no outside, because space is bound. Spatial justice is the struggle of various bodies, human, natural, non-organic, technological, to occupy a certain space at a certain time. And spatial justice happens at the moment where there's withdrawal of one body to make space for another body. So something to ponder on. In other words, Massey urges us not to see space as abstract. So neither the business at the background, nor only the structures at the forefront, but rather the relations between the human and the inhuman, and the human and the non-human elements within those spaces, and how these are always unequal power relationships. But speaking of the businesses in the background, I'm now finding myself in the Department of Mercantile Law, so I'm thinking a lot about the role of business, the role of the economy in upholding spatial injustice. And in thinking about this, I've come across, and this is how I want to connect to the mention of corruption in the invitation and the mismanagement of municipalities. Now, the King 4 is, or the King's Report is a report on corporate governance that's issued by the Institute of Directors of Southern Africa from time to time. And the most recent King Report, King 4, includes a very interesting sectoral supplement. It includes a supplement for municipalities. In other words, according to King 4, municipalities should also be subjected to the corporate governance principles of companies. And the reasons that it states for incorporating municipalities is, amongst others, calls because of corruption and because of mismanagement. I am really concerned about this inclusion of municipalities in, and I'm concerned. So on the one hand, sure, it could lead to better governance. It could address the problems that you also raise in the introduction. But I'm concerned because this privatization or linking municipal governance so closely to corporate governance can lead to a privatization and still this very public role that cities play, that governance in cities through municipalities play, specifically in participation, in interaction. And I think, as Zanele has said, to encourage participation beyond merely elections and participation in the everyday life of the city. And here I go as a final point to the idea of the right to the city, which is a very pertinent idea in spatial justice theory, of course, coined by Henri Lefebvre, French philosophers, French sociologists, already here in the 1970s, but it has been taken up by social movements such as Abahlali Basemjondolo. Sibusiso Kode has just this year at his acceptance speech of the Swedish Ange Prize said that the price for land, for decent housing and the right to the city is paid in blood. So a very active phrase that's used in our discourse. But again, I want to take a feminist angle to the right to the city. And here I want us to think about the right to the city. A colleague of mine, Marius Peters, who many of you would know, he distinguishes between the right to the city and rights in the city. But I want to also move this and push for the right of the city. And here I have my good colleague Tsepo Madlingozi to thank for making me think of this right of the city, because that pushes us to think of the city not only as something that one accesses, that one gets the entry into, but something that exists because of these relations between those who inhabit it and the interactions between the human and non-human elements in the city, the infrastructure, the amenities, but also the inhabitants. And here, just one source that I want to highlight too, maybe Alison Goebel has done a lot of work on the right to the city for women in Sunduzi in South Africa. And I think in that respect, also we often overlook these other spaces. There's a lot of work done on Cape Town, Johannesburg, but other cities, Bloemfontein, Pietermaritzburg, and Sunduzi, but also smaller cities and other more ordinary everyday spaces are sometimes overlooked. But in the feminist right to the city, in Dove Fenster's The Right to the Gendered City, Different Formations of Belonging in Everyday Life, really calls for this gendered idea of the right to the city, the right of the city, where she talks about appropriation and participation. And I think that speaks somehow to the involvement of the youth in really belonging in the city through the exercising the right to difference, the right to differ, the right to belonging through the right of participation and the right of appropriation, which for me forms part of this gendered understanding of the right to the city. And that takes us back to how we imagine the city, these images and imaginings, the picture that we have in our head of the city, of space. What is space? Or should I rather ask, who is space? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. de Villiers. Those were very challenging reflections, especially regarding the role of the city and who is the city exactly. At this point, I would like to open up the panel to dialogue. There are a couple of questions in our chat box, and I don't know if the panelists have seen these and if anyone would be able to have a go to just answer some of these questions before we move on to the question and answer session from my side. I think one of the themes that's coming out most strongly is something that you touched on, Dr. de Villiers. I think most of the speakers have touched on it in different aspects, and it is the role of business, corporations, and other institutions in ensuring spatial justice. So one of my questions, and I'll open it up to the panel, is that how do we imagine the role of these other institutions? As we've mentioned that politics needs to serve towards inclusion into the economic system. We've mentioned that the law is a tool to entrench, but it's beyond the law. So how do we imagine other factors, as the state being a key actor and the law? How do we imagine the introduction of other actors such as the church, such as business, such as CSOs? How can we imagine their role in ensuring a more spatially just South Africa?
Hey, Terrace, Sanele here. Maybe I can have a bit of a go.
Thank you, Dr. Sandra.
Yeah, look. I mean, it's a difficult question, because I think a lot of the times when that question is asked, it is premised on the assumption that business has an interest in the development of a society that is just, that is equal, that aspires towards relationships that are human, as in between business and its citizens. And unfortunately, I think historically, and I think South Africa is a very good example of this, that this is not the role that business has played historically. Business has historically played an exploitative role here. Business always use, well, business, let me see, I'll go for always. Business always uses its power and its influence to ensure that how government conducts itself is in its interests. And of course, in that, we also need to recognize that at times the interests of business are such that social provisioning must happen. So I think if spatial justice is something that we take seriously, or the attainment of spatial justice is something that we take seriously, we also have to problematize the role of business in the production first of spatial injustice and the perpetuation of spatial injustice. Because one of the interesting facts that doesn't get discussed very much is in how the early mining history of South Africa is what produces the pass system. It's what produces the compound system. In many ways, it's what produces the idea of establishing locations to serve the interests of business. And I think that's really been the relationality of business to the broader populace and the organization of space. And I think the way that our cities look continues to reflect this. And this is why the way in which we engage with history is important if we want to actually identify what the source of the problem is. Because if you can't identify what the source of the problem is, or what the source of the thinking that informs how our cities are organized, I think we stand very little chance of disturbing current spatial injustice, which really is a continuation of past spatial injustice.
Thank you, Dr. Sibanda. Thank you for that reflection. I will open up to the panel again if anyone wants to take this question.
I think I can just follow. Thank you, Zanella. I agree with you. Two things maybe, of course, spatial justice theory so the broader spatial turn in law, of course, is there, and it's a broader turn to spatiality. But spatial justice, if we look at the theorists like Edward Zoja, David Harvey, etc., it's had a big impact. They are radical geographers. So in other words, their theory is based on Marxism. In other words, the means of production, the ideas around labor, the idea of how capital produces space, the whole idea of production of space is already within the idea of spatial justice. So I think perhaps from the perspective of law, we need to look a little bit more at that element of spatial justice. So I think you spot on, Zanele, also in mentioning one thing that Alison Goebel does very nicely in a book. She talks about of the right to the city. She talks about firstly just the right to arrive in the city. And she writes about how women initially were tolerated in city spaces for beer brewing, which of course facilitated other businesses and was good for the mining sector, etc. So yes, there's definitely that historical link, but also a present link. And in that I want to talk about what scholars who have used the work of Doreen Massey, one such a scholar, Davina Cooper and Sarah Keenan, in taking her work further, talks about this holding up of space. So yes, these spatial relationships are produced, and then the space reproduces these relations, but the space holds it up. In other words, it takes a lot of work almost, is what they say. And what holds this up is all of the social conventions, but then also definitely business, the economy, the power relations that they are within business. So I think you are spot on there. I want to link that then to the question posed by Ontatile. Ontatile, thank you very much. That is such an important question. She asked the question about public spaces and the importance of public spaces in participation. And I think we should jealously guard our city spaces, but also just our spaces as public spaces and as true publics. So in other words, a public space where democracy is possible, where there's an emphasis on difference and differing. And I think that is really the problem with city spaces and with the ousting of difference and really of the chilling effect it has on difference and the right to differ and to challenge and to participate. And I think it all links together with an increased privatization, which of course links back to the business world. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I move on to my next question, or taking me into my next question, which is going to be around issues of the law, as mentioned as well by all of the panelists, as the law as the tool to entrench, but also the need for us to go beyond the law. I see here a question from Dr. Murcott saying that what are our thoughts on SPLUMA and the mechanisms to seek to advance spatial justice? And this links with my broader question regarding the constitutional framework, and I will direct this to Dr. Sibanda, but again, it's a dialogue, so everyone can feel free to come in. But the constitutional and the legislative framework being one of the reasons that as we look into history, apartheid, colonial era, being one of the reasons why we have the cities that we have and the spatial setting that we have. But now in the post-apartheid setting, there is almost efforts to use the law to redress this, which have been successful at varying measures. So the question is, what are our thoughts on SPLUMA and its mechanism to speak to advance spatial justice? But another key question related to that is, what is the role of the constitutional and legal framework in addressing this issue of spatial injustice? And is it enough for us to legislate this issue, or is there, what role does the law play? Thank you.
Do you want me to go, or do Dando and Busha want to come in before?
They can come in if they have anything to add.
You can go ahead, Dr. Zaman.
All right, cool, thank you. Okay, I'll try. Yeah, try and remember to speak. Put my camera on when I speak. Look, I'm going to connect, Tadaloko, I'm going to connect your question to one in the chat directed at me from Dr. Murcott, Melanie Murcott, around my, what she characterizes as my skepticism around rights. And I'm going to answer that very, very, very directly and say, I guess if we must frame it as a skepticism around rights, it's a skepticism that is born of the fact that rights give us many claims and many hopes for change, but it becomes a problem when those rights actually fail to translate into material change. And in failing to translate into material change, you then have a situation where there is a perpetuation of the legacies of apartheid. And I think this speaks to the constitutional framework then around space, land, property, and so forth. And whilst the Constitution contains many provisions that afford the disenfranchised, the disempowered, previously disadvantaged rights, rights that promise some form of rearrangement, of spatial arrangements, that very same Constitution also at 1994 and 1996 guaranteed the rights of the propertied, the wealthy, those who had the beneficiaries of colonial apartheid. I think that one of the most apt ideas as to why rights can be a little bit can be misleading in terms of what they give us, or what the post-1994 moment or period of constitutionalism, where a rights-based culture is adopted in South Africa, was captured by Makau Mutua when he talks about rights as a double-edged sword. And it's this idea that at 1994 and 1996, when the post-apartheid constitutional state comes into being, is that those who benefited under colonial apartheid, the beneficiaries of colonial apartheid, also received rights in the same way as those who were excluded and disenfranchised. And what you then have is a situation then where those who have the resources, the power, and I'm really glad Isolde keeps raising the question of power, the issue of power relations, but those who have the resources, power, means, education, and so forth, use those rights to dictate the pace of change, or to more decidedly influence the pace of change, which then takes us back to our original conversation, which then leaves a lot of South Africa's black population with the electoral ballot as their one source or avenue to change, which then means that the possibility to actually effect change is reduced to a period every 5 years of electing somebody else in the hope that they will go and do your bidding. Now, this doesn't mean that the millions and millions of South Africa don't have rights. They do have rights, but the question has to be, how is it that we continue to live in a situation where those rights have not been translated into disruptive material change that has reorganized the political economy of South Africa in a way that those millions and millions of Black South Africans, and I use Black in a political sense to encompass, I guess, what we speak of as people of color these days. But how is it that Black people in South Africa continue to be outsiders in their numbers to the political economy, and whites were the primary beneficiaries of colonial apartheid continue to have most of what they had. And yet we have rights. And I'm not saying that we should do away with the rights, any of the rights, but we have to ask ourselves, how do we make them translate into material change? And I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Dr. Sibanda. I think that's you've touched on an important aspect regarding rights translating into material change. And one would then raise the question around policy direction, and if what can be done to make the policy direction regarding housing, regarding spatial justice, access to resources, to make it more relevant towards translating rights into action. And I think in this question, it leads me to my next question, which is, what steps can we take to alleviate beyond the law, beyond speaking about the Constitution, the rights? What steps and what, I know we spoke about business, but there are other role players there, as we've had mentioned by Ntando, the church, through organizations like Ndifuna Ukwazi, where Buhle works, through civil society, through academia. How then can we inform policy direction? What is the role of other organizations in this endeavor to become spatially just and to work towards policy that actually translates into tangible results? I don't know if Ntando and Buhle would like to come in there.
Let me jump in.
Okay.
Let me jump in. But I profusely apologize that my camera is not on. I've joined through a cell phone because of challenges with my laptop currently. But there's been quite a lot of discussion, even around the policies, Bloom and so on, that the colleagues have been speaking about at this point, and the businesses and the role of businesses and this question of spatial justice and injustice. And maybe the reality is that in South Africa today, the rights of those with power, the rights of those with the capital, with money, and the interest of businesses has assumed the precedence over the interest and the needs of the masses of our people. And the reality is that even businesses in themselves are further entrenching this special injustice that was speaking about, even in the context of developments and so on, and businesses and their interest being used. Particularly, I'm talking about maybe an area such as Woodstock, where majority of colored, Black and working class families stay, who are being priced out of their homes, so that the area is being gentrified, and all this is done in the interest of businesses and making Cape Town look beautiful and luxurious at the expense of the masses of our people. And you have mechanisms in place to try to mitigate against these things, insofar as the policies are concerned, and these plumas which speak to land use management in our country, and each municipality has those set of policies and legislative duties, which in actual sense have been really been negated by the municipalities. The cities refuse to regulate private property market to ensure a more spatially just city. And this is despite, again, the slew of legal and regulatory tools at its disposal. And the actual fact is that the city's policies or the government policies and practices have negated the principle of spatial justice and its tenets to redress inclusion and tenure security, which is actively denying this principle of equitable distribution in space of socially valued resources and opportunities. And you see this in the ongoing disposal of valuable land, public land, that governments across the country, or rather municipalities across the country, continue to do, insofar as, instead of addressing the crisis of housing, by extension the spatial injustice, they continue to dispose land to private property powers, to businesses, and this is all done at the detriment of people. So the reality is this, insofar as this question of then moving beyond law, finding alternatives. The reality is that in as much as we want to work within the framework of the legislation, the important mechanisms that could be deployed is really the empowerment of people, the empowerment people on the ground, to be able to pose as, a counterpower to the incumbent that continues to perpetuate the legacy of spatial injustice. And you were speaking about the law and the constitution, and we know that the protection of basic human rights have been left to the courts as the last bastion of upholding people's rights and human rights. But what we've seen the law doing in this country is that you have local authorities in the context of even your law enforcement agencies who continue to engage in what could be described as the perpetuation of indignity and war against poor people. Is that you have law enforcement agencies even in the places that people have been condemned to live in the outskirts. What you see is that there's a pervasive disdain for the lives of poor people, majority Black people whose homes they currently view as mere structures. You see law enforcement agencies destroying people's homes in this country. And we're in the middle of a housing crisis. We have over, particularly in Cape Town, 360,000 backlog, and people are living in pipeline projects. In pipeline projects, the state continues to say that it will build housing for people, and that doesn't become a reality. And generations continue to be then, condemned to live in squalor and so forth. And the reality, insofar as really mitigating against this testament of injustice, is that and dehumanization that continues to define the experience of our people. They were in precarious tenure position, is that we must use the law, and with the recognition that law can only take you so far. It can only take you so far, and the testament of that is that people have been on the waiting list and tried mechanisms at their disposals, to the extent that people are occupying land and this speaks to the failure of the government of our day to address the challenges of spatial justice for our people. And by extension, I think the question of spatial justice, we need to look at it in the frame of people are also, are currently in informal settlements today. How does spatial justice look for people in informal settlements, right? Beyond just inclusion in the city centers. And that for me would speak to the question of basic provision of basic services, the dedensification of informal settlement and social amenities. And part of saying that we must go to the cities is that we want to be closer to social amenities. And part of then this question of who are currently here, how do you mitigate against this thing? It's a provision of these services to where people are at currently. So that people that live in a spatially just environment. So, there's a clear disjuncture. There's a clear disjuncture that exists between constitutional rights of equitable access to land and the rights against arbitrary disposition of our people. And I'm saying this hesitantly that, again, law can only take us so far. I'm an activist, I'm not an academic, and I really believe in building the counterpower, building people's power, and that as a viable solution. And I'm using this loosely, subject to interpretation. But yeah. That's where I'm at, and maybe to go back to let me leave it at that. But I'll really engage as we're going on with the conversation.
I'll speak from my position as a theologian in the Christian tradition, working with church space. And I agree with Ubuhle that not that the law can take us so far, but that we are the carriers of the law. And I want to go back to this thought of dynamics. So even in law, those who engage it, those who actively pursue it, tend to have the law lean in their favor. And you see that historically and also in the post-apartheid era. And I've seen it personally in the process of the spatial development frameworks that has happened in the last 2 years in South Africa, particularly in Cape Town, where I used to live. But with regards to civil society and in particular the church, and I want to talk about the continuum of the church. So those who are moneyed and have landedness within the church, individuals in the church, as well as the institutional church, as well as those who may not be as moneyed and are landed, have landlessness within that continuum. I would say if to work outside of or beyond policy and beyond the law, I would state a few things. First, naming, resisting, and subverting. So all of us on the panel have mentioned in some way or another the dynamics that are involved in spatial injustice. And the first thing I would say for something like the church is to name the things that are pushing dynamics off kilter, which are pushing power towards certain sets of people over another set of people. The second thing that we could do outside the law is to resist, perhaps partnering up with spatial justice movements, social justice movements, to act in advocacy and active citizenship and to continue to hear how, from those below, how the law is being used, as well as space is being used to entrench injustice. The third thing I would say that we could use outside of the law is to subvert these actions. So to move against the off-kiltering of power dynamics by, for example, a church in Mowbray, which is middle to upper middle at this point due to gentrification. A church in Mowbray housed home street-based people for a number of months during the hard lockdown last year and helped them to transition into permanent housing and have a structured plan towards job development. So that is subverting the dynamic that exists in spatial injustice in South Africa. There are those who are landless in South Africa who have built rogue gardens, as you can say, that to sort of subvert the food production in South Africa that says food production must come from a supermarket and the supermarket is placed outside of your region. They've subverted that part of spatial injustice by having food closer to home, by having food that is given freely to some people in their areas. And so for me, it is to actively engage with the law so that you, as those who are from below, but also those who are powered, are able to resist spatial injustice that is being fed through businesses in the law. It is the resistance and then the subversion of these acts of spatial injustice. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you for those reflections, Ntando. I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to come in on this one before we take a question from the chat box. Okay.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Okay. One of the questions in the chat box, and it also will link to a broader question that I'm going to ask the panel and the attendees at large, is how do we navigate facilitating spatial justice where communities are unwilling to be relocated? And this speaks to issues of, identity, issues of belonging, where people are being relocated from land which they've had to, place themselves on because of necessity, and now because of the issues of the fact that the land is probably unserviced, the land is not close to amenities or unsafe for occupation, they have to be relocated from this land. But of course, they've made links and bonds to this land because of the reflections that we've been making about the nature of space and its linkages to identity and broader issues. So I'd like to also just ask regarding that aspect of how do we deal with those unwilling to relocate, and what methods can be put in place, as well as the interference of third parties in terms of relocating people who have occupied land illegally. So the infamous case of the red ants is one very topical issue when it comes to evictions of land. This happened last year during the hard lockdown, where communities were removed forcibly, their land, their houses destroyed, as Buhle was alluding to, in Johannesburg, and I think it also happened in Cape Town. And as well as Dr. de Villiers alluded to the fact that this is only in the popular places where there's a privilege, so to speak, of exposure, and we would not be privy to what's happening in other communities. So what solutions can we make to prevent this dehumanization, if it were, of people in occupying land illegally, and how do we then balance removing them from the land and ensuring that they are removed in a dignified manner, if needs be?
If I may jump in, just briefly, insofar as this question of how you navigate the relocation of people and so on, and this question of evictions as it were, that continues to dehumanize and really displace the majority of our people. The reality is that the evictions that are happening in this country, and those most of the time you have extrajudicial evictions that are happening, and demolitions, particularly in the context of informal settlements that are happening. And all of these things happen without the safeguards of the law. And what you see as a result of these evictions is that people are being rendered homelessness. Into homelessness, and there isn't any mechanisms that are really deployed insofar as accountability is concerned. And you have actors such as your public and private actors such as your Red Ants, in the context of Cape Town, law enforcement. And these are structures and bodies that continue to contravene the principles of the PI Act, that people must and cannot be evicted without an order of the court. But you have law institutions that are supposed to be upholding the law, breaking the law, and that's a reality of the matter. And really, in the context of Cape Town, you have bodies that there's no accountability mechanism, as I was saying, such as law enforcement. You cannot trace the constitutional basis of the existence of that structure and body, such as law enforcement. We cannot trace it, and that's why they're running amok, really, in destruction of people's property and all of that. And I think a very practical, or rather a very problematic thing insofar as the evictions are concerned is that there's no provision of alternative accommodation. There's no provision of alternative accommodation, and that's why people are being resistant to these unlawful evictions. And there's something that is being used in the terminology that is being used insofar as illegal occupations. That's terminology that is used by the state to criminalize our people, and not cognizant of the fact that people are really responding to the need. People are not occupying out of just wanting to do so, but it is a need. It is out of having been on the waiting list, and people will not sleep on the waiting list. People will not stay on the waiting list of the database of the government, waiting for provision of housing. And the reality is that people will be displaced. The relocation that we are talking about when you're saying people are not willing to move, rightfully so, because they're being displaced. You have places such as Overfields, Campus, and Blakestop in the context of Cape Town. And in those areas, there are no services. In those areas, you have no transportation. In those areas, you have no schools that are nearby. And that's why people are being resistant. People are not saying that they don't want to be relocated, but it's a question of where you are being relocated. And there's a principle of a 5-kilometer radius that is not really embedded in law. But if you're moving a person, you must move them not so far from where they are. And this speaks to then the question of unlocking parcels of land, land being equitably redistributed in the context of the prime land in the city center of Cape. In the city center, there are a lot of vacant parcels of land that must be unlocked so that those are used for housing people. And if you were to tell people that they are being relocated to those parcels of land, I'm quite confident that you'd have no resistance from people insofar as relocation. But it's where people are being relocated that becomes an issue and a problem to the masses of our people. So really mitigating this challenge really requires a rapid release of land, prime land, that is, and really in the context of informal settlements, to speak to informal settlements upgrade. And this will speak to this question of basic services that must be provided so that even those spaces are especially just, if you like. So let me leave it at that. But to say that the evictions in themselves show no regard for human dignity, and the confines of the law must really act within them, and you utilize policies that are there, such as the PI Act, to protect people from these extrajudicial and illegal evictions that are happening.
Thank you, Bushle. I would just like to bring you back because I know that this is something that relates specifically to what you do, but also opening to the panel as we touch down, because we're nearing 1 p.m. and just wind down and make our closing reflections. One of the questions then is, how do we mobilize these disenfranchised youths and population at large who live on in these periphery communities whose dignity, as you've alluded to, is not being respected? How then, what methods do we mobilize them to participate? And I know Dr. Sibanda alluded to the fact that there's no participation in a system that does not benefit them. So is it a completely lost cause in that regard, or are there ways in which we can mobilize? And I know that you are the head of political organization at Ndifuna Ukwazi. How can youths be mobilized towards participation? I suppose whether it's political formal processes such as elections or other processes where their voice can be heard in terms of civic engagement.
Yeah, I mean, young people in this country today, even in the peripheries, the urban outer core, are disenchanted politically. They're disenchanted because there is a lack of political will insofar as addressing the needs and the interests of young people in this country, and rightfully so. They get disenchanted and disillusioned with the system that doesn't benefit them, but really condemns them to conditions of poverty. So there is that. And I wouldn't necessarily say that they're disillusioned insofar as participating in the political economy of the country and the political activities of the country, because that would be incorrect to say that they're not. The reality is that they are, but in a different form, a different platform. And you see that by the acts and really the actions on the streets that we see. But what is quite apparent and very clear is that people are seeing that the system and the incumbent is not working for them, and they are seeking alternatives outside the party political system that we see today, and young people have no faith in the political parties, and would say that that's why they're not voting, because they don't see material change in their conditions, and that's what young people need to see. And in the context of spatial justice, young people are in the urban outer core, and job opportunities are in the city center and so on. And part of that, it is to try to deal with that disjuncture there, and deal with bread and butter issues of young people, to try to really address those. And young people would really be not as disenchanted insofar as participatory in democratic processes of the country. But I do not want to say that they are not politically active, but in the realm of party politics as we know them today, that are deeply entrenched in corruption and all of those things, and people do not have faith in the system as is. And I see a lot of them, even those ones that are actively participating in occupations and so on, because the majority, some people that have participated in the current wave of occupations that I've seen, and that is a political expression. That is a political expression of being tired of your needs not being met. And the only way, it's not a one size fits all insofar as to say how to mobilize young people to participate. It's a question of really the state meeting its obligation towards young people, job creation, and really speaking to the interests and the needs of young people, so that young people are able to be meaningful participants in the democratic processes of our country.
Thank you, Buhle. Anyone else on the panel who would just like to contribute to that?
Perhaps I'll just make final concluding remark then. That's fine, Tariro. To link to the previous question about forced removals. I think also just to throw in the possibility of in situ upgradings. For my doctoral project, I worked on the case of Schubert Park versus the city of Tshwane. And of course, a 2012 court decision in the favor of the inhabitants of Schubert Park and finding against the city of Tshwane. And it turned out the decision of the city of Tshwane, they tried to evacuate, they claimed that they evacuated the inhabitants. The Constitutional Court found, of course, that it was not an evacuation, it was an eviction, and therefore they should have followed the constitutional principles. But it turned out to be a very expensive decision by the city of Tshwane, because they then had to provide alternative accommodation. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is today, next year will be 10 years after the findings of the court case. It will be 10 years that they've been paying the rent of Schubert Park residents. The only information I have is statistics from 2017. And already at that stage, it was more than 1.5 million rands on the city's books, and that just continues. So I think the possibility of in situ upgradings, where that is really the question. The problem here was that the relationship between the city and the inhabitants soured, and instead of attending to that relationship, the city evacuated the residents, and that shouldn't have been done, and they've paid dearly for that. So that to link. Then I think I would like to thank Buhle. Thank you so much for contributing specifically from your perspective, and I think for contributing this term, this concept of political expression. And I think political expression, instead of just participating in voting, and I think political expression is what I mean also with the right to differ and the right to difference as entrenched in the right to the city. And then as a very final remark, I know that I've been critical about the inclusion of municipalities in the King 4 report, but maybe in light of what we've said about the role of the economy, of business, of companies, of perhaps there's a positive way to read this as well, and that is that if we start seeing businesses as spatial. So in other words, we look at the law as spatial, as relational. And if we can start thinking about businesses in a more public sense, perhaps that will address some of the issues that we've also mentioned here today and their complicity in perpetuating this spatial injustice. But that from my side, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. de Villiers. Anyone else on the panel to address the question before we move to the concluding remarks?
I just want to make a couple of quick points. I think the first one, relates to forced removals. And the point with respect to the forced removals, not to detract it all from what Butle said, which I think really captured many of the issues. But I think one of the main issues really relates to the fact that in far too many instances, the way that these removals happen are reminiscent of an era that we would like to think has gone by. The approaches and practices and the treatment of people treats people as if they are surplus, as if they are fungible, as if they are merely objects. They're objects for the government or some department to decide what happens to them. And in spaces where people do not have civil society organizations to represent them, the treatment is unbelievable, and this results in protest and so forth, and a breakdown of relations. So we really do need to think about how people get to participate in the decisions around where they live and how they live. And I think this also speaks a little bit to Isolde's last point, that we really need to think a bit more about in situ upgrades. But again, this should not be something that's top down. And I think with respect to youth participation, I think we really need to take our thinking beyond participating every 5 years and thinking, or maybe just not even thinking, imagining ways in which there is inclusion and participation in between elections. And this means looking very carefully at our institutions and our structures of governance. I think we have a very, very thin conception of democracy in practice. I think there's an incredible theorization around democracy and participation, but what we see in practice is far removed from this. And then there was a comment from Lloyd Kuvea about why the governments of South Africa, Angola, and Kenya haven't done more to bring change with respect to business. And in the briefest of ways, it's to say that a lot of the times business has such influence over government that you end up with a situation where government actors and public servants organize themselves or see themselves as elites, and as elites they see themselves as having more in common with businesses and business interests, and then policy and practice tends to be skewed in favor of business. And I mean, I guess a response might be to say, no, but it's the people that vote government in. Well, this is true enough, but politicians also know what to go and say to people leading up to elections, and make promises and make gestures and so forth and so forth. But when they are in power, our system of democracy again is such that for those years when politicians are in power, they are really difficult to have any influence or control over, which is not the case in business, and which is why business generally, doesn't concern itself too much around elections, except by way of giving money. So I think we do also need to recognize that politics is broken. It's not just in South Africa, but the system liberal democracy is in crisis in many parts of the world, even in those countries which we like to characterize as developed or first world countries. The system is in crisis, and we need to imagine different ways of doing things that are actually inclusive and deliberately work towards humanizing, rehumanizing our people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sibanda. Thank you for those reflections. We'll go on to Ntando for her final remarks.
I think my final remarks would be to really recognize the dynamics in our context as well as anybody else's context on the call, and to ask ourselves, why do we continue to ask this question around how do we mobilize the youth when the youth has made multiple remarks to society to say, we are making remarks, you're just not hearing them. And I think I would leave with that question. Should we ask how to mobilize the youth? Or rather, should we ask how to hear the youth that is already mobilized? And I think quickly that is my final remarks.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to thank the panelists and all the attendees who've attended with us this afternoon. The discussion has been very insightful. Thank you so much for everyone who has asked questions in the chat box, everyone who has interacted with us in the question and answer box. As Bonolo indicated at the beginning of the discussion, we are hoping that this will become a policy paper that can help us to contribute to the solutions of the issues that we are discussing. And we hope that as we have come up with these discussions, as we've spoken, we will be able to work towards more relevant policies, more relevant ways of interacting, more relevant ways of regulating space, especially with most of the perspectives that have been brought through here. So from the side of the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit, from the Center for Human Rights, thank you to everyone who has attended. Thank you to our panelists. The discussion was very rich. And we've come to the end of our webinar this afternoon. We are streaming on YouTube and Facebook, and the recording will be available after the session. And thank you once again for joining and interacting with us. Enjoy your day further.